II had impacted Canadian history in a major way, as the Canadian government revoked many rights and changed the lives of Japanese Canadians. Between 1941 and 1945, over 21,000 Japanese Canadians were limited of their rights and freedoms and were forced into internment camps, quote unquote, for their own good. The Japanese Canadians were considered enemies by the Canadian government the day after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. They had lost many of their rights as well as their property that was confiscated. Even though the Canadian government promised that they would receive their property back after the war, Japanese Canadians were still forced to suffer through the harsh nature of internment camps. After all those years of internment, the end result was that the Japanese Canadians were given the freedom to move and were given a formal apology by the government in 1988. Not only did the internment of Japanese Canadians tear families apart and scar the lives of many innocent civilians, but it also made the Canadian government open their eyes and realize how they were treating different ethnicities, even though Canada was supposedly a free country. The first generation of Japanese Canadians arrived between 1877 and 1928. When they arrived, they were denied the full rights of citizens, such as the right to vote in provincial and federal elections and to work in certain industries. In 1874, BC politicians pandered to white supremacists that wanted to pass a series of laws restricting the rights to Asian Americans. These laws excluded Asians from underground mining, the civil service, and professions such as the practice of law, which required the practitioner to be listed on the provincial voting lists. Labor and minimum wage laws ensured that employers hired Asian Canadians only for menial jobs or farm labor, and paid them at lower pay rates than Caucasians. Although Asians were working much harder and longer in the same fields as white people, white labor unions accused them of unfair competition, stealing jobs, and undermining their efforts to raise the living standards of white workers. The Japanese Canadians that were living in quote unquote relocation camps were not legally interned. They could leave so long as they had permission. However, they were not legally allowed to work or attend school outside of the camps. Since the majority of Japanese Canadians had little property aside from their confiscated houses, these restrictions left most with no opportunity to survive outside the camps. The Canadian government hoped that selling all of the Japanese Canadians' personal possessions and property would deter them from returning back to British Columbia. Prime Minister King issued a ruling that all property would be removed from Japanese Canadian inhabitants. Dispossession began with the seizure and forced sale of Japanese fishing vessels in December 1941. After the seizure, the boats sat in disrepair for several months before being sold by the Japanese Fishing Vessel Disposal Committee at below market prices. After this precedent being set, BC politician Ian Mackenzie wanted to make sure that Japanese Canadians would never return home, and achieved this by selling all of their farms and property for as cheaply as possible below market price. David Suzuki is an environmental activist and science broadcaster who experienced these internment camps at the age of 5. In 1942, the government sold Suzuki's family dry cleaning business, so after the war they would have nothing left. They then interned David and his 2 sisters and his mother in an internment camp in Slocan. His father was sent to a labor camp 2 months prior. After the war had ended, Suzuki and his family were forced to move east of the Rockies. Initially, Japanese Canadians were treated very poorly and had their citizenship revoked and rights restricted. Over time and after the war, Japanese Canadians would be released from their internment camps, but since all their property and possessions were sold, they had nothing to go back to. Nowadays, Japanese Canadians have all their human rights and are no longer being discriminated against by the government. I think that Japanese Canadians were treated very poorly in the past, but the government has apologized for those actions and now Japanese Canadians are being treated equally and thriving in all their respective endeavors.